There was a point at which my love of history and my fascination with astrology came together when I discovered that astrology had always been a part of the historian's toolbox in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, and my tutors at university regarded this as a matter of complete irrelevance, and for me it was incredibly fascinating, so I set out to explore that, and that involved becoming a historian of astrology, but also, in order to be a historian of astrology, an astrologer of history, in order to play out and experience the astrologer's mindset. There's an overall theme here that fascinates me at the moment, which is the way in which people use the sky as a backdrop for the stories they tell. So people create myths, they try and find meaning, they try and explain the mystery of the relationship between the moon and the tides. And the sky, especially the night sky, but as history developed, the day sky as well, became the kind of backdrop upon which heroes, heroines, gods, goddesses, planets exerting influence and so on would move, conducting some great formal balletic dance. And this then provided a mirror for human beings to examine their own lives, and from my perspective, particularly historical and political and cultural affairs. History can be defined as the study of what happens when time unfolds. And a calendar, a whole time system, depends on the rotation of the Earth against the movement of the Sun and the Moon. And when people do without clocks, that also becomes referenced against the movements of the stars and the planets as well. And so there was a kind of system of metaphors that developed from the idea that the moon has an obvious relationship with monthly cycles, obviously the tides, and the sun an obvious relationship with the seasonal cycle, which affects society. So you extend by analogy from that to planets, and people created an elaborate system according to which the coming together and moving apart of various planets was a means of dividing up historical periods and anticipating future historical changes. And this was an incredibly important system. It's been written out of the history of the writing of history. You read a book about medieval historians, you're never going to read that planetary cycles were important to their conception of the way society worked. But it's true, they did, and younger scholars are increasingly recognizing this. And so, you know, I'm very interested in the way that people from the past, the medieval, Renaissance, historians, political scientists, would have viewed the kind of planetary cycles which we experience in the 20th, 21st century. There were the multiple conjunctions and oppositions between Uranus, Neptune, Jupiter and Saturn in the late 80s and early 90s. Now, the medieval and Renaissance historians would not have known about Uranus and Neptune, but they would have been looking at Jupiter and Saturn and anticipating small historical upheaval. But when later astrologers added Uranus and Neptune to the toolbox, they created something which earlier astrologers would have recognized. And it was always the assumption that the slower moving a planet, the more profound its effect. So the newer planets, Neptune, Uranus and Pluto, were discovered. They moved slowly. So according to the old methodology, their effects are more profound. There was a conjunction between Uranus and Pluto, two slow-moving planets. So according to the medieval methodology, that has to be profound. According to more modern astrologers, it's a revolutionary point. The great thing about that example is that we've got evidence from all sides. So the astrology anticipates a moment of revolution. The 1960s is unambiguously represented as a moment of revolution. I mean, it's the 40th anniversary of 1968. BBC radio, which I listen to all the time, is just full of reminiscences, accounts of 1968 from different perspectives. You know, we've got the Cultural Revolution in China, the May Days in Paris, the Prague Spring, war demonstrations in the USA and so on. And it was the same last year with the 40th anniversary of 1967, which is the Summer of Love, psychedelia. So there's all sorts of external evidence in the press, the cultural accounts and so on, people's lives and reminiscences, that this was an important time. And astrology said, yes, this will be an important time. So we've got an unambiguous somehow framework there that however you see astrology, somehow it provides a referential point for understanding turning points, if you like, full stops between the sentences of human affairs, paragraph breaks. We're coming up to another important Uranus-Pluto point. So I would go back to the previous nearest point, previous similar point, which was 1933, which was it's a bit gruesome, but it was the coming to power of the Nazis. So what some of the astrological reformers would have done that I'm interested in the 17th century was say, okay, this happened last time, so how do we prepare for the next time this happens, which is going to be 2010 to 2014? And the particular person I'm interested in is Johann Kepler, the 17th century astronomer, amazing astronomer, also an astrologer, and he thought astrology could be used to maintain social and political stability for the good of everybody. So he argued that if you see a difficult planetary alignment coming up, and the one we're looking at is slightly difficult, he said institute political reforms. He said people will protest, there is bound to be dissent and upheaval, therefore a good government will reform by anticipating the possible cause of discontent and alleviating them. So in practical terms, doing something about poverty. And he also, and this is very interesting in view of the current times, said he won't get outbreaks of war if there's a strong peace movement. So we've got an astrology of prediction and an astrology which can analyze history. But for Johann Kepler, there was an astrology of doing something about it. You don't just sit down and say, oh, there's difficult times coming up ahead. You join or form the peace movement. And that to me is it's a powerful example of a view of astrology in action. In March 1933, there was a 90-degree aspect between Uranus in Capricorn and Pluto in Aries. And so the political referential point for that is Adolf Hitler becoming Chancellor of Germany in January 1933 and inaugurating like the absolute worst point of European fascism, which had been developing for 10 years. He comes to power, it becomes worse. So I try and look at some of the characteristics of what Nazism represented. You know, it was exclusive. There was an in-group and an out-group. It deified violence. It was considered a good thing to be violent. And it was generally destructive. Now, there's a way of looking at these sequences of planetary conjunctions which can see them moving from like a death phase to a life phase. And so it so happens that the one we're moving up to, which is Pluto in Capricorn squared Uranus in Aries, in a way a very interesting reversal of the previous one, is in what would be identified as a life phase. And so we get, if you like, an inversion of the previous square. So whereas the previous one was exclusive and glorified violence, the next one could be inclusive and glorifying peace.